in the hush of a candlelit chamber where old parchment meets the dust of forgotten centuries, let us begin a tale not of heroes, but of those whose crowns bore the weight of misdeeds. We shall drift gently into the shadows of medieval thrones, where power did not always shine with honor, and where history, that patient scribe, recorded not just the deeds of the great, but also the grave missteps of the terrible. Imagine the winding halls of cold stone castles, banners draped above, rusted suits of armor, and echoes of whispered fear from servants and courtiers alike. This journey shall not be one of horror or fright, but rather a tranquil exploration of the flaws and fates of monarchs who let darkness creep into their rule. These were men, after all, flesh and spirit, flawed, burdened, and often, profoundly, alone upon their thrones. Let us first pause to understand what it means to be terrible in the context of medieval kingship. Not all terrible kings were wicked by design. Some were simply overwhelmed, ill-prepared, or ruled by impulse rather than wisdom. Others were cruel, yes, calculating and merciless. But often, even their cruelty was shaped by the storms of the times, the weight of lineage, or the shadows of their own minds. In this story, we shall drift through centuries, from the darkened courts of early medieval Europe through the feudal tumult of the High Middle Ages and into the fractured twilight of late medieval rule. Each part of our story will shine a quiet lantern upon one king, his life, his choices, and the path of sorrow or ruin he carved through the lands he ruled. We begin not with judgment, but with curiosity. Let our minds wander gently to a time when belief in divine right sanctified the authority of kings, when laws were etched not just in parchment, but in blood and fire. Thrones were often won by lineage, but kept by sword or by cunning. A crown could be a symbol of order, or a curse of desolation. Throughout this journey, you may find that these kings were not entirely without virtue. History is a tapestry woven in greys, not blacks and whites. But what marks these rulers as terrible is not a single act, but a reign remembered for imbalance, where fear outweighed justice, where subjects wept in silence, and where a kingdom's spirit withered beneath the weight of royal error. In this first part, we shall set the stage for the figures to come. From King John of England, whose name still stirs shadows in English history, to Charles VI of France, haunted by a mind undone, to the cold reckoning of Ivan the Terrible, who, though straddling the edge of the medieval era, left a legacy so chilling it echoes even now. But let us not hasten. Our tale unfolds slowly, like smoke curling through a morning mist. We will hear of the forgotten kings too, those lesser known, but no less severe. Ezzelino da Romano of Italy, for instance, remembered more as a tyrant than a noble. Or Wenceslaus of the Holy Roman Empire, whose neglect bled his realm of peace. These are not names always found in the forefront of history books, yet their stories are richly layered and deeply human. For each of the 22 kings, we will venture into their courts, their conflicts, their choices. We will listen to the murmurs of the people beneath them, peasants, knights, clerics, and nobles, and we will trace the subtle erosion of trust between ruler and realm. Our approach will be soft, deliberate, and contemplative. This is not a tale of scandal or sensationalism, but rather a slow unraveling of character and consequence. We will ponder the loneliness of power, the perils of pride, and the tragic echoes of paranoia. We will feel the weight of a scepter in trembling hands, and the chill of betrayal in the echoing halls of royal courts. So now, rest your mind upon this threshold. Let go of the noise of modernity and allow yourself to be drawn into the ancient hush of candlelight and castle walls. You are no longer merely a listener. You are a quiet observer of time's slow dance, walking unseen through the pages of history. In the next part of our journey, we will meet our first king, one whose reign became a cautionary tale, not just for his own people, but for the future of monarchy itself. a ruler so infamous that even the Magna Carta arose in resistance to his rule. But tonight, as the first candle burns low, we end our prelude with a whisper of what is to come. Kings rise, and kings fall. Some leave monuments, others leave scars. As dawn breaks gently over the soft mists of medieval England, the tale draws us to the shadowed throne of one of the most infamous rulers in English memory, King John, the monarch who reigned not with grace, but with a clenched hand and a wounded pride. He was not the first of his line, nor the noblest, but his name lingers like a low murmur across time, a warning, a sorrow, a monarch remembered not for his splendor, but for his failures. John, born the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, was never meant to be king. From the beginning, his path was crooked, carved more by circumstance than destiny. His elder brothers, each bold, warlike, or revered, drew the lion's share of attention and inheritance. Richard the Lionheart, his immediate predecessor, was the warrior prince of crusading fame, leaving John in his long shadow. And yet, fate, ever capricious, placed the crown upon John's head in 1199, after Richard's death left no legitimate heir. At first glance, John's reign might have promised stability, but the years that followed were marked not by strength, but by suspicion, betrayal, and a steady decline of royal dignity. John's greatest flaw, perhaps, was not cruelty in its rawest form, but the absence of trust. He trusted no one, not his barons, not his allies, not even his family. And in return, few trusted him. His court was a place of fear rather than admiration. He taxed his nobles heavily, squeezing coin from every corner of his kingdom. Even the church found itself under his heel, as John defied Pope Innocent III in a long and bitter struggle over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury. In retaliation, the Pope excommunicated John, casting a spiritual shadow over the entire realm. It was an unprecedented act, one that left the people of England uneasy and divided. But perhaps it was on the fields of France where John's legacy darkened most. His attempts to hold on to the Plantagenet lands in Normandy failed spectacularly. Through poor diplomacy and even poorer military planning, John lost vast territories to the French king, Philip II. These lands had been the pride of the Angevin Empire, rich, powerful, and strategically essential. Their loss was not merely a political blow, but a wound to English pride, and it turned many of John's own nobles against him. Yet John's cruelty was not reserved solely for distant lands or political rivals. He was known to imprison the families of dissenting nobles, to extort money through the threat of violence, and to treat justice as a tool of personal revenge. It was whispered that he starved a noblewoman and her son to death within the stone walls of Corfe Castle. Whether the story was wholly true or twisted by time, it painted a chilling picture of a king unbound by mercy. The final spark came not from his enemies abroad, but from within. The English barons, weary of his heavy-handed rule and constant demands for money, rose in rebellion. Their demands coalesced into a single historic document, the Magna Carta. It was not the elegant Charter of Liberty we might imagine today, but a firm and practical list of limitations on the king's power. It was born from desperation, not idealism. In June of 1215, beneath the grey skies of Runnymede, King John affixed his royal seal to the Magna Carta. Yet even in this act, his spirit was reluctant. He agreed not out of wisdom or remorse, but out of necessity, hoping to buy time and sow division. As soon as the barons left, John sought to nullify the agreement, leading to further war and unrest. His reign ended not with triumph, but with decay. In 1216, John fell ill. Some said from dysentery, others whispered of poison, and he died in the eastern marshes of England. He was buried in Worcester Cathedral, beneath a plain tomb far quieter than the noise his rule had stirred. His son, Henry III, ascended as a child, and the land sighed in relief. And yet, though John's rule was marked by failure, cruelty, and division, his legacy shaped England profoundly. The Magna Carta, though initially dismissed, would echo across the centuries. It laid the first stones of constitutional thought, the idea that even kings might be bound by law, that a monarch's power was not divine and limitless, but conditional upon justice and duty. John's reign was terrible, yes, but not because he was a monster. He was deeply human in his fear, his hunger for control, and his inability to inspire loyalty. His tragedy was not grandeur turned sour, but smallness inflated beyond its limits. He could not carry the weight of kingship, and so he wielded it as a weapon, and in that, he became a lesson etched into England's foundation. So, as the torches, dim within the great halls of his memory, we step gently away from the reign of King John. His was a rule of caution, a whisper that power without respect is hollow, and that a crown, if worn poorly, can be heavier than iron. In our next tale, we journey to France, where another monarch, haunted not by ambition, but by madness, will lead us into the quiet corridors of a mind unraveling. As we leave the troubled reign of King John, our path drifts softly eastward, across the gentle swell of the English Channel, to the heart of medieval France. There, in the twilight of the 14th century, a different kind of sorrow gripped the throne, not of cruelty, but of confusion, not of tyranny, but of a mind slowly slipping into the fog of madness. Charles VI of France, born in 1368, came to the throne at a tender age. At just 11 years old, he was crowned amidst a kingdom weary from the 100 Years' War. France, though proud and ancient, was weary, its lands burned by conflict, its people broken by plague and famine. The boy king offered hope, a symbol of continuity and divine order. And in his early reign, there was reason for optimism. He was known as Charles the Beloved. At first, his court shimmered with promise. Guided by wise advisors, Charles brought a measure of peace and stability. He was intelligent, handsome, and well-spoken, with a noble bearing that pleased even the most skeptical nobles. The French crown, still mending from the struggles of his father's reign, felt secure once more. But beneath the surface, winds of uncertainty stirred. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly, whispers among servants, glances exchanged in the dim corners of the court. Charles, once so composed, began to show signs of agitation. He grew irritable, then erratic. At times, he failed to recognize those closest to him, his wife, his children, his counselors. He became prone to violent outbursts, followed by stretches of eerie silence. Physicians were summoned, and prayers were whispered, but nothing could still the tremors of his mind. The most chilling moment came in 1392, on a journey through the forest of Le Mans. Charles, dressed in the finery of a royal hunt, rode with his companions when suddenly, without warning, he turned upon his own escort. With sword drawn and eyes wild, he attacked them in a frenzy. 4 men were killed before his attendants could subdue him. He collapsed, unconscious, and was carried back to the palace. This marked the beginning of his long descent into what historians would call intermittent madness. At times, Charles returned to lucidity, calm, sorrowful, aware of his affliction. But these moments grew fewer. He began to suffer delusions, at one point believing he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. He refused to bathe or change his clothes, fearing invisible threats. Courtiers tiptoed through his chambers, terrified of awakening the storm. The governance of France fell into chaos. With the king often incapable of ruling, power passed into the hands of his relatives, particularly his ambitious uncle, Philip the Bold, and later the powerful Duke of Burgundy. Rival factions emerged, most notably the Armagnacs and Burgundians, each vying to control the kingdom through influence over the broken monarch. France, already fractured by war with England, now tore itself apart from within. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, tried to maintain dignity amidst the ruin, but she too was swept into the web of courtly intrigue. Accusations flew of infidelity, betrayal, and manipulation. Some blamed her for Charles's madness, though she bore the burden of a crumbling monarchy with more endurance than many remember. She became the de facto regent at times, her name whispered in both reverence and disdain. The people of France, seeing their king drift further into madness, began to despair. How could a nation be led by one who could not even recall his own name? The divine right of kings, once a pillar of medieval belief, now seemed fragile. Was this a punishment from God, or a cruel twist of fate? And still Charles lingered. He lived for more than 4 decades, reigning, if such a word could still apply, until his death in 1422. In those long years, France crumbled. The English, under Henry V, seized vast swathes of land. The Treaty of Troyes disinherited Charles's own son, recognizing Henry as heir to the French throne. The crown was diminished, the nation adrift. When Charles finally died, there was little mourning beyond the palace walls. He was no longer Charles the Beloved. He had become Charles the Mad. His funeral was quiet, his legacy uneasy. His son, Charles VII, would have to rebuild a realm left in spiritual and political tatters. Yet even now, we must approach his memory with gentleness. For Charles was not evil, not cruel. He was, perhaps, one of the most tragic figures to wear a crown. A man born to rule, gifted in his youth, and then slowly undone not by ambition or war, but by the unkind workings of his own mind. His story is not one of tyranny, but of sorrow, of a soul lost in a palace too vast to hold him. His tale reminds us that the burden of a crown is not only political, but deeply personal, that even kings can be vulnerable. That power, without the strength of mind to wield it, becomes a cruel and hollow thing. As the curtains fall upon Charles VI's chapter, the candle flickers softly in the halls of French memory. A king once cherished, then feared, then forgotten. In our next chapter, we will turn our gaze to the cold lands of the north, to a ruler whose cruelty was deliberate, methodical, and chilling. His name would come to define terror itself. As the frozen winds whisper across the endless steppes of old Russia, let us now tread carefully into a land both majestic and merciless. Here, beneath the vast sky and amidst the creaking pines of ancient forests, a new kind of monarch emerged, one who would change the face of Eastern power forever. His name was Ivan, and though history would grant him many titles, Grand Prince, Tsar, Sovereign, one name would cling to him with a chill that time cannot shake. Ivan the Terrible. Born in 1530 into the ruling Rurik dynasty, Ivan IV entered a world already shadowed by treachery and loss. He was only 3 years old when his father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died. A council of nobles, the boyar class, assumed power, and Ivan's early years were shaped by betrayal and neglect. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, struggled to keep control, but died, likely poisoned, before Ivan turned 8. The boy who would become a Tsar grew up within stone walls, surrounded not by affection, but by manipulation, starvation, and violence. He watched courtiers murder one another for influence. He was often ignored, even mistreated. There are whispers from the palace servants, stories told in hushed voices, of young Ivan throwing animals from towers, of long silences punctuated by sudden rages. A boy who learned early that power could not be requested, it had to be taken. When Ivan reached the age of 16, he crowned himself not as Grand Prince, but as Tsar of all Rus. It was a new title drawn from the Latin Caesar, and it announced something profound. Ivan was no mere ruler of a principality. He was emperor of a reborn Russia, God's anointed representative on earth. His early reign showed signs of greatness. He modernized law codes, improved infrastructure, and sought to curb the power of the unruly boyars who had tormented him in his youth. He founded printing presses and invited foreign artisans to Moscow. His marriage to Anastasia Romanovna brought a rare period of calm to his soul. The Russian people, long suffering under fragmented rule, dared to hope. But shadows had not left Ivan. They merely waited. When Anastasia died suddenly in 1560, Ivan's grief became a torrent of suspicion. He was certain she had been poisoned by the boyars, by foreign agents, by anyone. Whether this was true or not, the result was the same. The Tsar began to descend into darkness. He withdrew from the court. His trust in others, never strong, evaporated. And then, in a moment that reshaped Russian history, he created the Oprichnina, a state within the state, governed solely by his command. He appointed the Oprichniki, men clad in black robes, mounted on black horses, who carried brooms and dogs, heads as symbols, one to sweep away treason, the other to sniff it out. With them, Ivan unleashed a reign of terror. Cities suspected of disloyalty were razed, families were slaughtered, clergy and nobles alike disappeared into dungeons or were paraded through streets before their execution. In Novgorod, a city Ivan feared might defect to Poland, thousands were murdered in a single winter campaign. The rivers ran red beneath the snow. Yet through it all, Ivan believed himself righteous. He wrote long letters to enemies and allies alike, defending his deeds as divinely sanctioned. He saw betrayal everywhere, and in preemptively crushing it, he thought himself a protector of the Russian soul. There is one moment, quiet yet terrible, that encapsulates his torment. In a fit of rage, Ivan struck his own son, also named Ivan, on the head with his staff. The boy died days later. The Tsar's screams echoed through the halls as he cradled the body, overcome with remorse. The painting that memorializes this moment, with Ivan's wild eyes staring into the void as he clutches his bleeding son, has become one of Russia's most haunting images. His later years were marked by further war and confusion. The Livonian War drained resources and ended in stalemate. The economy faltered. The people, exhausted by fear and famine, grew listless. Ivan took more wives, some of whom died mysteriously. He alternated between religious devotion and unspeakable cruelty. When he finally died in 1584, playing chess as the story goes, there was no great mourning. He left behind a shaken empire and a feeble heir, Fyodor, a sickly and devout man, unfit to rule. Russia would soon fall into the time of troubles, a period of famine, civil war, and foreign invasion. And yet, Ivan was not a madman without vision. His terrible reign unified Russia in a way none before him had. He centralized power, established a concept of autocracy that would shape Russian rule for centuries, and carved the foundation for the Romanov dynasty that would follow. His cruelty, as shocking as it was, came from a place of deep fear, pain, and conviction. He was not simply terrible in the modern sense. In Russian, Grozny means formidable, awe-inspiring, even mighty in wrath. He was terrible like a storm, like fire, destructive, but undeniably powerful. So as we leave the snow-covered palaces of Moscow behind, we do not do so with peace. Ivan the Farfar does not rest quietly in the chronicles of kings. He looms, part myth, part man. A ruler who tried to shape Russia in his own anguished image, and in doing so, left scars that centuries have yet to fully heal. In our next chapter, we return westward to the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, where a ruler of indulgence and neglect, more pitiful than fierce, would lose the respect of an entire realm. Let us now leave behind the frost-bitten spires of Russia and travel gently into the heartlands of the Holy Roman Empire, a realm not ruled from a single throne, but a patchwork of duchies, bishoprics, and free cities stitched loosely together under the imperial crown. It was here, amidst the velvet drapes of court and the cluttered scrolls of compromise, that a king named Wenceslaus once reigned, or rather, failed to reign. He was not cruel in the way of tyrants. He did not swing the sword of vengeance or spill rivers of blood. His reign was terrible not through action, but through absence, through inaction, through a neglect so deep and sustained that it bled the empire of vigor and drowned its people in slow confusion. Wenceslaus was born in 1361, son of Charles IV, one of the most respected emperors of the Holy Roman realm. Charles had been a ruler of learning and wisdom, a patron of Prague, and a model of medieval kingship. His hopes for his heir were high. Wenceslaus was crowned King of the Romans, an imperial title denoting the successor, while still a child. And when Charles died in 1378, the crown passed to his son with pomp and expectation. But expectation can be a heavy crown. Wenceslaus, raised in luxury and surrounded by flatterers, never truly learned to rule. Where his father had been diligent, he was careless. Where his father had built bridges between nobles and nations, Wenceslaus built walls of avoidance and drunkenness. In his youth, he showed promise. He was intelligent and fluent in Latin, admired for his eloquence and manners. Yet as the years passed, that promise dimmed. He developed a taste for drink that grew into dependence. Days turned to weeks where the emperor could not be found, hidden away in his hunting lodges, lost in ale, ignoring petitions and letters from across the empire. The Holy Roman Empire, already a fragile construct, needed a steady hand. Its politics were delicate, requiring negotiation among German princes, powerful bishops, and rival dynasties. Without guidance, these factions began to pull in opposite directions. In Bohemia, his native land and the jewel of his inheritance, discontent simmered. The nobility felt neglected. The church grew wary. Meanwhile, Wenceslaus allowed corrupt advisors to run his affairs, men who sought wealth over peace and favor over fairness. His failure to mediate disputes, particularly among the powerful electors who had made him king, led to unrest. Matters worsened with time. In 1394, a group of nobles abducted Wenceslaus and imprisoned him. It was not an uprising of peasants or foreign enemies, but his own peers who, frustrated by his inaction, saw no other way to preserve order. Though he was later released, the insult was grave. The empire had lost faith in its leader. And still, Wenceslaus did not change. He continued to ignore the empire's needs, returning to his secluded estates in Bohemia. One might imagine a ruler tortured by his failure, but there are few signs of such regret. His letters from this period, when they do appear, are brief and meandering. He seemed to drift, as though the weight of the world had slipped from his shoulders, and he had no desire to pick it up again. Eventually, in 1400, the electors acted. They declared Wenceslaus unfit and elected a new king, Rupert of the Palatinate. It was an extraordinary act, nearly without precedent. Wenceslaus, however, refused to abdicate. He held on to the title of King of the Romans until his death, though no one truly considered him emperor after 1400. He withdrew entirely to Bohemia, ruling there with diminished energy and little public presence. Bohemia itself began to suffer under his inattentive rule. The seeds of discontent, long ignored, took root. Religious tension flared, especially around the growing influence of a preacher named Jan Hus, whose calls for reform would one day ignite the Hussite Wars. Had Wenceslaus intervened wisely, had he shown even a flicker of his father's political acumen, perhaps the tragedy could have been softened, but he remained distant, aloof, lost in his own fading world. When Wenceslaus died in 1419, there was no grand mourning. His reign had become a whisper, his legacy a shadow. He left behind no children, no strong alliances, no reforms, just a kingdom unraveling and an empire that had moved on without him. Yet in his story, we find a quieter warning. Not all terrible kings are wicked. Some are simply absent. Some wear the crown without conviction, allow the roots of discord to deepen, and leave the garden of rule to grow wild. And in their silence, harm blooms. Wenceslaus teaches us that kingship demands presence, that indifference, while less visible, than cruelty, can be just as destructive. His was a reign of missed chances, of forgotten duties, of a throne occupied, but never truly held. And so we light a candle for Wenceslaus, not in rage, but in melancholy. A man who might have been great had he only stayed awake to the calling of his crown. In the next chapter, we shall leave the courts of emperors behind and step into the narrow streets of Padua, where a nobleman turned despot carved a legacy of blood. His name, Ezzelino da Romano, a man whose very name stirred fear from the Alps to the Adriatic. Now our path drifts southward, across the Alps, and into the rich, sun-drenched valleys of northern Italy, a land of walled cities and stone towers, where rival families vied for power, and the scent of rebellion mingled with olive trees and incense. Here, in the 13th century, one name was uttered with more fear than any other. Not a king, but a lord. Not a sovereign in title, but a despot in deed. Ezzelino da Romano. To speak his name in the marketplaces of Padua or the churches of Verona was to feel a hush fall over the crowd. Mothers warned their children with tales of his cruelty. Chroniclers, even those trained in restraint, described his deeds with trembling pens. For Ezzelino did not merely rule, he dominated. His was not a reign of neglect or weakness, but one of ruthless, relentless terror. Born in 1194 into the powerful Romano family, Ezzelino came of age in a time of deep unrest. The Italian peninsula was torn between two great factions, the Guelphs, who supported the papacy, and the Ghibellines, who stood with the Holy Roman Emperor. Ezzelino was a Ghibelline to his bones. His loyalty to the empire would shape his entire life and justify in his mind every cruel act he ever committed. He was not always feared. In his early years, Ezzelino was seen as an intelligent and capable nobleman. He married into another powerful family and held lordship over several cities. But his ambition was never content with mere governance. He believed the cities of northern Italy must be unified, by force if necessary, and ruled with absolute discipline. When Emperor Frederick II arrived in Italy to assert his imperial claims, Ezzelino became his most loyal and brutal enforcer. With imperial blessing, he began a campaign to seize control of the Veneto region, bringing cities like Vicenza, Verona, and Padua under his iron grip. He was tireless, cunning, and utterly devoid of pity. He established a reign unlike anything the region had seen. In Verona, he built a fortress within the city, housing his personal guards and secret chambers for torture. Anyone suspected of disloyalty, be they noble or common, could be imprisoned without trial. Executions became a public ritual, designed not just to punish, but to instill dread. His cruelty was not merely functional, it was theatrical. He once rounded up the entire nobility of Padua and marched them, bound and barefoot, through the streets. Some he mutilated, others he had burned alive. Still others were left to rot in pits beneath his castles. Women and children were not spared. Mercy was not a word spoken in his court. Chroniclers from across Europe wrote of him as a demon cloaked in human flesh. One monk described him as the son of the devil, fed on the milk of dragons. Another claimed he forbade all laughter in his court and punished it as treason. These may be embellishments, shaped by fear and time, but they speak to the image he projected and perhaps cultivated. And yet, amid the horror, there was method. Ezzelino brought a twisted kind of order. Roads were safe under his rule. Taxes were collected efficiently. Trade resumed, guarded by the very soldiers who enforced his tyranny. He was not a madman. He was a cold, deliberate architect of power, believing that only through fear could unity be achieved. But even fear has limits. As the years passed, resistance grew. Cities once conquered began to rebel. Exiled nobles formed alliances, and even those once loyal to the emperor began to question the wisdom of supporting such a ruthless ally. In 1259, a coalition of Guelph cities, led by Milan, rose up against him. At the Battle of Cassano d'Adda, Ezzelino was wounded and captured. He died days later in captivity, refusing food, medicine, and even a priest. His body was shown to the people to confirm his death. Such was the disbelief that this monster of a man could truly perish like any other. His death was met with celebration across Italy. Bells rang. Prayers of thanksgiving filled cathedrals. Statues of him were torn down or defaced. And yet, even in death, his legend endured. He was not merely a tyrant. He became a symbol of tyranny itself, a warning passed from one generation to the next. But let us pause here, in the quiet aftermath of his rule, and consider the soul behind the savagery. Was Ezzelino simply evil, or was he a man shaped by the chaos of his time, convinced that only brutal order could save the cities he governed? He did not seek wealth or pleasure. He lived austerely, rarely indulging in feasts or finery. His life was one of strategy and domination. He ruled not for delight but for control, and in that perhaps lies his tragedy. He could have been a statesman, a unifier, even a reformer, but he chose fear as his instrument, and in doing so, poisoned the very unity he sought. The stone walls of his fortresses still stand in places, weathered by centuries, their silence far gentler than the man who built them. Birds now nest where screams once echoed. And the cities he once crushed now bloom freely, their people remembering, if only in fragments, the man who tried to bend them beneath his will. As we close this chapter, the sun sets gently over the Venetian hills. The tyrant sleeps at last, and the land breathes easier in his absence. In the next chapter, we move to the Iberian Peninsula, to a kingdom fractured by legacy and fire, where a monarch's cruelty was forged not only by pride, but by deep ancestral insecurity. As the soft winds carry us westward across the rugged peaks of the Pyrenees, we descend into the sun-baked lands of Castile, a kingdom of stark contrasts, where gleaming citadels rose above dusty plains, and the clang of Christian and Moorish swords still echoed through the annals of its long Reconquista. It was here, in the heart of 14th century Spain, that a king emerged whose name became synonymous with suspicion and blood. Peter of Castile, known to some as Peter the Just, but remembered by most as Peter the Cruel. Born in 1334 to King Alfonso, Alphonse and his mistress, Eleanor de Guzman, Peter was no stranger to courtly conflict from the moment he drew breath. Though later legitimized, he was raised in an atmosphere simmering with envy, manipulation, and vendetta. His mother wielded influence over Alfonso, much to the fury of the Queen, Maria of Portugal, and her allies. When Alfonso died, that fury erupted. Queen Maria ordered the execution of Eleanor, Peter's mother, and in doing so ignited a fire in her son's heart that would never truly be extinguished. At just 16, Peter inherited the crown. Young, intelligent, and already hardened by betrayal, he ascended the throne of Castile in 1350. At first, his reign seemed promising. He moved decisively against corruption, reformed parts of the administration, and protected urban merchants against the abuses of the feudal nobility. He was a king who acted swiftly, often too swiftly. Justice, in Peter's hands, became a double-edged sword. One of the earliest signs of his merciless streak came in his dealings with the nobility. Many grandees believed the young king would be malleable, but Peter shocked them by executing several prominent lords for conspiracy. He did not bother with formal trials. His rule, he claimed, was justice enough. Fear soon crept through the royal court. But the greatest fracture in his reign came not from politics, but from within his own family. Peter's half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, was born of a different mother, but shared royal blood. A fierce rivalry blossomed between the two. Henry believed Peter's rule to be illegitimate, a tyranny born of bastardy. Peter, in turn, saw Henry and his supporters as traitors. What followed was a bitter civil war that would span decades, involving France, Aragon, and even England, whose Black Prince intervened on Peter's behalf. The war, brutal and unrelenting, consumed the kingdom. Cities were besieged, alliances formed and broken, and loyalties shattered like glass. But even amid this chaos, Peter found time to pursue his own vendettas. He had his wife, Blanche of Bourbon, locked away within days of their marriage. Some say she was poisoned. Others claim she died alone in confinement years later. Her crime, according to Peter, was treachery. According to others, she was merely a pawn in a cruel game. Peter's violence extended beyond political necessity. He was known for sudden, explosive punishments. Men who had once dined at his table vanished in the night. Others were strangled before his eyes. He allegedly killed a nobleman with his own dagger during a banquet and watched with calm detachment as the body was dragged away. Yet there was another side to Peter, less spoken of, but visible in the margins of history. He was a protector of the Jewish population in Castile at a time when many rulers turned a blind eye to persecution. He appointed Jewish advisors, defended Jewish communities from mobs, and punished those who incited violence against them. This earned him admiration among some, but hatred from others, especially the nobility, who resented his inclusion of non-Christians in court affairs. In this, Peter was both progressive and pragmatic. He sought loyalty where it could be found, regardless of faith or tradition. But even his kindnesses often carried the chill of calculation. Few trusted him completely. By the late 1360s, his conflict with Henry reached a final crescendo. Betrayed by allies and worn down by years of warfare, Peter faced his brother one last time at the Battle of Montiel in 1369. Captured after defeat, he was brought into a tent where Henry awaited. What happened next remains one of the most infamous moments in Spanish history. The two brothers, both fierce, proud, and wounded by years of hatred, fell into an argument. Words turned to blows. Henry drew a dagger. In the struggle, Peter was stabbed, then struck again and again until he lay dead. His body was stripped and tossed into a rough grave. So ended the reign of Peter of Castile, abruptly, ignobly, in the grip of fraternal bloodshed. Henry took the throne, beginning the Trastamara dynasty that would shape Castile's future. He quickly painted Peter as a monster, spreading stories of his cruelty and madness. Many of these tales stuck. The name Peter the Cruel entered chronicles and classrooms, and yet some still called him Peter the Just, claiming his violence was aimed at the corrupt and the treacherous, and that he punished all, regardless of station. Who then was the real Peter? A tyrant, a reformer, a man broken by childhood, scars and shaped by endless betrayal, perhaps all of these. His reign was one of contradictions, of bold policies and private murders, of social progress and brutal vendetta. He ruled with fire and was consumed by it. And so, as we leave behind the scorched cities of Castile, let us reflect on the double nature of justice. How easily it may become vengeance when wielded without mercy, and how the cruelest kings are. Not always those who begin as villains, but those who allow pain to harden into policy. In our next chapter, we will sail northward to Denmark, a kingdom of icy coasts and quiet woods, where a king named Christian II will show us how ideals, when poisoned by paranoia, can unravel a nation. Our course now follows the northern winds, across the swelling seas and cold, misted coastlines of Scandinavia, to a realm nestled between fjords and pine-cloaked hills. Here lies the kingdom of Denmark, stoic, proud, and shaped by both sea and sword. It was in this serene and frost-hardened land that a king named Christian II rose to power with lofty ideals, but fell into history marked by blood and betrayal. Christian II, born in 1481, was a man of contrasts. Crowned king of Denmark and Norway in 1513, and later briefly of Sweden, he was a monarch who began with reformist dreams. He sought to modernize the kingdom, reduce the influence of the aristocracy, and protect the rights of commoners. For a time, he was even called Christian the Good by hopeful voices. But as we've seen so often in the pages of this story, power can warp vision. And Christian's crown became not a symbol of hope, but of ruthless ambition and fear. From the outset, Christian's court was unconventional. He married Isabella, of Austria, a Habsburg princess of high lineage, but scandalously kept a Dutch commoner, Dyveke Sigbritsdatter, as his mistress. Dyveke's mother, Sigbrit, became one of Christian's closest advisors. A woman wielding power at court, especially one not of noble birth, was deeply resented by the aristocracy. The nobles whispered, conspired, and plotted, fearful of their waning grip on the realm. Christian, in turn, mistrusted them. His reforms sought to limit noble privileges, establish a stronger central administration, and grant cities more control over their affairs. In trade and taxation, he favoured the middle classes and foreign merchants, drawing ire from traditional landowners. What might have been a noble vision for balanced rule slowly hardened into authoritarianism. His policies, once idealistic, were enforced with increasing severity, and then came Sweden. At the time, Denmark was bound in a loose union with Norway, and Sweden the Kalmar Union. But the Swedes, proud and fiercely independent, resented Danish oversight. Christian launched a military campaign to subdue Swedish resistance, led by the nobleman Sten Sture the Younger. The war was brutal and prolonged. When Sten died in battle, the resistance faltered, and Christian seized Stockholm in 1520. To celebrate his victory and formally claim the Swedish crown, Christian organized a grand coronation. Nobles, bishops, and dignitaries gathered in the great halls of Stockholm. Feasts were held, oaths were sworn. Peace, it seemed, had arrived. Then came the betrayal. Just days after the festivities, Christian ordered the arrest of over 80 Swedish nobles and clergy. They were accused of heresy for opposing his rule, a charge as political as it was theological. Over the course of 3 days, they were executed in the town square. Heads rolled across the cobblestones. Blood flowed beneath church walls. This massacre, later known as the Stockholm bloodbath, sent shockwaves across Scandinavia. Christian claimed the executions were necessary to maintain order and punish treason. But to the Swedes, and even many Danes, it was a horrifying act of betrayal. A festival turned into a slaughter, a crown secured through murder. The backlash was swift. Sweden rose in rebellion, this time under the leadership of Gustav Vasa, a nobleman whose family had suffered in the bloodbath. By 1523, Christian's forces were defeated, and Sweden broke permanently from the Kalmar Union. Gustav became king, founding the Vasa dynasty and ensuring that Christian's name would be reviled in Swedish memory for centuries. Back in Denmark, Christian's grip also began to falter. His increasingly harsh rule, especially his reliance on foreign mercenaries and controversial advisors, alienated his own nobility. Uprisings simmered, and in the same year he lost Sweden, the Danish aristocracy, deposed him. His uncle Frederick I took the throne. Christian fled into exile, but he would not give up easily. For nearly a decade, Christian plotted his return. He travelled across Europe seeking support. He even converted to Lutheranism, hoping to rally reformist sympathies. In 1531, he launched a final attempt to reclaim his crown, sailing with a small force into Norway. It failed. He was captured, not slain, and imprisoned in a Danish fortress. There he remained, behind stone walls and iron doors, for the next 27 years. He lived out his days in quiet isolation, no longer a ruler, no longer a reformer, but a prisoner of his own ambitions. It is said he spent much of his time reading, writing, and brooding over the choices that had led him from promise to disgrace. Christian II died in 1559. His cell was opened, his crown long passed to others. His legacy, like his reign, was conflicted. Was he a villain, a tyrant drunk on power, or was he a reformer undone by fear and surrounded by enemies? In truth, he was both. A king who saw the need for change, but lost himself in the struggle to impose it. A ruler who believed justice could be enforced through steel. A man who loved deeply his mistress, his queen, his cause, but who let suspicion twist those loves into cruelty. His story, like so many in our quiet journey, is a tale of good intentions marred by pride and paranoia. It reminds us that the road to tyranny is often paved not with malice, but with fear and misplaced certainty. As we leave the chill of Danish shores behind, we next turn our gaze toward the heart of Italy once more, where the Borgia name reigned supreme and a teenage monarch named Giovanni would leave behind a legacy not of rule but of ruin. As morning breaks over the warm stone hills of central Italy, we return once more to a land of marble cloisters, crimson-robed cardinals, and courtyards scented with rosemary and betrayal. This is not the Italy of peaceful Renaissance learning, nor of Michelangelo's gentle brush. No, this is the Italy of whispered poisons and cloaked ambition, the Italy of the Borgias. And at the heart of this shadowed tale is Giovanni Borgia, a young man born into privilege, cloaked in power, and drowned in suspicion. Though not a king by title, Giovanni ruled with all the impunity of one. His lands, his soldiers, his decrees, they bore the weight of papal blessing, and yet his name now rests uneasily in the long hall of medieval rulers who left behind not peace, but whispers of cruelty, indulgence, and a death too mysterious to fade. Born in the mid-1470s, Giovanni was the son, perhaps the illegitimate son, of Rodrigo Borgia, who would become Pope Alexander VI. In the opulent and corrupt world of the Renaissance papacy, family ties outweighed vows of chastity. The Borgia Pope openly promoted his children, securing them titles, lands, and influence across the papal states. Giovanni, handsome, well-educated, and ambitious, was granted the title of Duke of Gandia and command over papal troops. But Giovanni's power came not through merit, but through nepotism. He lacked the cunning of his brother, Cesare Borgia, or the political finesse of his sister Lucrezia. Instead, he ruled as a young lion among sheep, entitled, impetuous, and careless with the lives of those beneath him. His territories stretched through central Italy and into Spain. In Rome, he presided over lavish entertainments, where fountains flowed with wine and dancers performed into the candle-lit hours. His household gleamed with wealth, drawn from church coffers and taxation of the poor. Even his armor was gilded, a statement not of readiness, but of vanity. But beneath the surface of golden banquets and papal favor, discontent festered. Giovanni was known to mistreat his subjects, extort money from merchants, and ignore pleas for justice. His soldiers, emboldened by his name, terrorized the countryside. Peasants were conscripted into service. Rival families were humiliated or executed under vague accusations of heresy or sedition. Giovanni believed himself untouchable, wrapped in the double shield of nobility and the church. Yet power, especially when worn without wisdom, attracts danger like moths to flame. In 1497, Rome was shocked into silence. Giovanni Borgia, at the age of just 22, disappeared. He had left his palace late one evening, dressed in black velvet and accompanied by a single servant. He said he was going to a private engagement. He was never seen alive again. The next morning, his horse was found wandering near the Tiber River, blood on its flanks. A fisherman later discovered a corpse tangled in the reeds. The body was stabbed multiple times and weighed down with stones. The features were barely recognizable, but the rings on the fingers confirmed it. Giovanni Borgia, Duke and son of the Pope, was dead. Pope Alexander VI, upon hearing the news, was inconsolable. He locked himself away, weeping for days. But even as he grieved, rumors erupted. Who had killed Giovanni? Theories abounded. Some pointed to jealous husbands. Giovanni was known for his affairs. Others whispered that rival noble families had struck. Some even suspected Spanish enemies, angry at his overreach. But the most persistent, and perhaps most chilling rumor, was this: that his own brother, Cesare Borgia, had orchestrated the murder. Cesare, ambitious and cunning, had long chafed at his ecclesiastical role as a cardinal. With Giovanni gone, Cesare soon abandoned the church and took up arms. assuming command of the papal armies and stepping into the role once held by his slain brother. Was it mere coincidence or a calculated act of fratricide? The Pope never officially investigated the murder. No one was arrested. No trials were held. The case was quietly buried, along with Giovanni's battered body. And yet, in the streets of Rome and the courts of Europe, the story lived on. Giovanni became a symbol, not of justice or rule, but of what happens when power, unchecked and indulgent, is passed into young, careless hands. Had he lived, perhaps Giovanni might have matured. He might have risen to meet the challenges of rule with the dignity his early years lacked. But we can only speculate. His legacy was sealed not by conquest or law, but by a single silent night and a plunge into the dark waters of the Tiber. His brief rule reminds us that power inherited is no promise of greatness, that a golden youth can become a tarnished legacy in the blink of an eye, and that in the corridors of power, betrayal sometimes wears a brother's smile. As the river flows on, long past the whispers of popes and princes, we close the chapter on Giovanni Borgia, a young tyrant remembered less for what he did and more for how he died. In our next tale, we journey north once more to the Emerald Hills of Scotland, where a king named James I sought to bring order to a wild land and, in doing so, unleashed a reign of vengeance and iron law. Let us now rise from the bloodied waters of the Tiber and drift with the wind to the north, beyond the English forests and into the rugged, rain-swept highlands of medieval Scotland. It is a land of brooding glens, cold lochs and stone fortresses, perched like watchful sentinels upon rocky cliffs. Here, in the early 15th century, a monarch returned from captivity to reclaim his throne. His name was James I of Scotland, and his reign, though brief, was marked by a chilling intensity that earned both admiration and dread. Born in 1394, James was the youngest son of King Robert III. From the moment of his birth, fate seemed to stalk him. His older brother died under mysterious circumstances, likely murdered, and his father, fearing for James's safety, attempted to send the young prince to France for safekeeping. But English ships intercepted his vessel, and James was taken, captive by King Henry IV of England. For 18 years, James was held in honourable confinement. He was treated as a guest more than a prisoner, educated by English tutors, exposed to chivalric culture, and trained in the arts of governance. Yet behind the courtesy lay a reality. James was a pawn, a bargaining chip to keep Scotland in check. He grew into manhood far from his native land, his crown always just out of reach. When he finally returned to Scotland in 1424, at the age of 30, he was no longer the uncertain boy who had left its shores. He was a hardened man, full of resolve, shaped by years of watching and waiting. His eyes had studied England's ordered governance and strong monarchy, and now, back in his homeland, he was determined to forge something similar, through force, if necessary. Scotland at the time was fractured. Powerful noble families, like the Albany Stuarts, held more sway than the crown itself. Clan rivalries festered. Lawlessness ruled the borderlands. James saw this chaos not as a challenge, but as a disease to be cut away. From the moment he took the throne, he ruled with startling decisiveness. He reformed the treasury, enforced royal authority, and reasserted the power of the crown over rebellious nobles. But his methods were often brutal. He summoned Parliament in Perth and began a purge. One of the first to fall was Murdoch Stuart, Duke of Albany, James's cousin and former regent. Alongside his sons, Murdoch was arrested, tried for treason, and executed. The executions were swift and public. Heads rolled on the black soil as James watched impassively from his throne. The message was clear: no one, not even kin, would challenge his rule. His law reforms were equally uncompromising. He cracked down on corruption, established regular, judicial circuits, and restructured land rights to limit the power of the great lords. For the common folk, this brought some relief. Justice, long denied, was now meted out swiftly. But even among the grateful, there was unease. The king's gaze was piercing, his patience short. James's reign was not devoid of brilliance. He was a poet of no small talent, composing verses during his captivity that later earned him praise. He patronized the arts and sought to modernize the court. Under his rule, the Scottish crown gleamed brighter than it had in a generation. But brightness often casts deep shadows. His unrelenting drive for control earned him enemies. The surviving nobles, stripped of their influence, simmered with resentment. Rumors began to swirl, of plots, of vengeance, of whispered alliances sealed in torchlit halls. In 1437, while residing at the Dominican Blackfriars Monastery in Perth, the storm broke. A group of conspirators, led by Sir Robert Graham and members of the extended Stuart family, infiltrated the monastery at night. James, alerted by his attendants, attempted to escape through a sewer tunnel, but it had been sealed off during renovations. He was trapped. The assassins found him in the dark, cornered and barefoot. What followed was no swift coup. It was a frenzy. The king fought back, wielding broken furniture as weapons, but he was overwhelmed. He was stabbed over 20 times. His cries echoed through the corridors, but help came too late. Queen Joan Beaufort, his wife, was wounded in the attack, but survived. She would later lead a campaign to hunt down the conspirators, capturing and executing them with brutal efficiency. The executions were drawn out and public, mirroring the violence that had ended James's reign. And so ended the life of James I of Scotland, a king who returned from captivity with a vision and pursued it with a cold, unflinching hand. Was he cruel? Perhaps. His justice spared few, and his governance tolerated no dissent. Yet many of his actions were driven by a desire to heal a broken realm, to impose order where disorder had long reigned. In him, we see the tragedy of reformers who seek too much control, too quickly. He sought to strengthen the crown, but did not live to wear it long. His legacy is carved into Scotland's memory, not in gold, but in granite, unyielding, sharp-edged, and cold to the touch. As we leave behind the grey stones of Perth and the rustling glens, our next steps take us east, to the rising sun and to lands ruled not by kings of Christian Europe, but by an emperor whose cruelty forged a nightmare that shook the Mongol steppes. Now we turn our eyes far to the east, beyond the familiar kingdoms of Europe, past the golden sands of Persia and the domed cities of Samarkand. We enter the world of steppe warriors, where swift horses cut across open skies and loyalty was measured in blood. This is the realm of Timur, often remembered in the West as Tamerlane, and in his own lands as Timur the Lame, a name drawn not from his character, but from a childhood injury that left him with a limp. But if his stride was crooked, his ambition marched in a straight and terrible line. Born in 1336 near Kesh in present-day Uzbekistan, Timur rose from humble beginnings. He was not of Genghis Khan's direct lineage, though he would later claim spiritual kinship. His early life was marked by hardship, but he was possessed of a sharp mind, a commanding presence, and a gift for warfare. He began as a mercenary, a minor commander in a landscape of feuding warlords, but through strategy, brutality, and sheer will, he carved an empire from chaos. By the late 14th century, Timur had become the dominant force across Central Asia. His campaigns extended through Persia, the Caucasus, India, the Middle East, and parts of Russia. His armies were fast, disciplined, and terrifying. Cities that resisted him were met not with siege and surrender, but with complete and utter destruction. Timur's name became a shadow that moved before his troops. His approach was often preceded by emissaries offering terms: surrender and pay tribute, or resist and face annihilation. Those who chose defiance faced horrors unmatched even in medieval chronicles. In Isfahan, after a revolt broke out against his garrison, Timur ordered the execution of tens of thousands. It is said that his men built pyramids of skulls from the dead, an act repeated in multiple cities as both punishment and psychological warfare. In Delhi, during his infamous campaign into India, his forces killed perhaps as many as 100,000 civilians. The once glittering capital of the Delhi Sultanate was left broken and looted, yet Timur did not see himself as a butcher. In his own view, he was a restorer of Mongol glory, a unifier of lands plagued by weak and corrupt rulers. He styled himself as a patron of Islam, though his piety was often drowned in rivers of blood. He funded grand mosques, madrasas, and gardens in Samarkand, transforming it into one of the most resplendent cities of the era. He held court with scholars and artists. He spoke Persian, Turkish, and Arabic. In his palace, poetry and philosophy flourished alongside war plans. And yet, his conquests left millions dead, countless cities in ruin, and entire civilizations reeling. Timur ruled not through loyalty, but through terror. His closest commanders obeyed him without question. He rewarded success lavishly, but failure was punished swiftly and often fatally. He was known to execute even family members who displeased him or appeared to challenge his authority. One story tells of a minor prince who boasted of his own bravery. Timur, unmoved, invited him to a feast, then had him trampled to death by elephants, his remains burned before the gathered nobles. It was not simply vengeance, it was theatre, a lesson in fear. He sought to emulate the great conquerors, Alexander, Genghis, the caliphs of old, but his legacy was forged more in destruction than unification. The lands he conquered rarely saw peace. After his departure, they often splintered, leaderless and weakened, vulnerable to fresh invasions or collapse. His final ambition was to march westward into China and restore Mongol rule there. But in 1405, as his vast army assembled, Timur fell ill. He died in Otrar, far from the glory he envisioned, leaving behind a fractured empire and a legacy drenched in both awe and horror. His body was buried in Samarkand, in the Ghuri Amir Mausoleum, a structure of exquisite beauty. But even in death, the shadow of Timur loomed long. When Soviet archaeologists opened his tomb in 1941, legend says they found an inscription: "Whoever opens my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I." The next day, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Coincidence or not, Timur's legend endures. To some, he remains a hero, an emblem of strength, vision, and discipline. To others, he is a monster, a man who cloaked genocide in banners of order and faith. And so, what are we to make of him? He was no mere barbarian. He was a builder, a thinker, a ruler, who saw the arc of history and tried to shape it in his image. But he did so with cruelty so vast, it defies simple judgment. His rule was absolute, his vengeance without mercy. As we step back from the smoking cities of his empire and return to the quiet steppe, we find a man of contradiction, a destroyer who planted gardens, a scholar who decapitated cities, a cripple who conquered nations. He reminds us that tyranny can come wrapped in beauty, intelligence, and purpose, and that even the finest architecture may be built upon bones. Our journey next takes us to the sun-warmed fields of Hungary, where a king named Sigismund reigned, one whose failures did not lie in cruelty or brilliance, but in an aimless reign that let hope slowly dissolve. As we drift westward once more, the smoke of Timur's burning cities fading into memory, we find ourselves among the broad, open plains and castle-strewn hills of Hungary, a land poised at the edge of two worlds. To the west lay the feuding realms of Christendom. To the east, the rising shadow of the Ottoman Turks. This was a land of frontier spirit and ancient nobility, and it was here that a man named Sigismund would rise to kingship and preside not with terror, but with tragic indecision. Born in 1368, Sigismund of Luxembourg was a man of pedigree. He was the son of Emperor Charles IV and brother to King Wenceslaus, whom we met earlier in our story. Destined from youth to wear crowns, Sigismund was ambitious and politically savvy, but he lacked the consistency, decisiveness, and depth of character that history's great monarchs demand. His rule spanned decades and titles. He became king of Hungary in 1387, king of the Romans in 1411, king of Bohemia in 1419, and finally, Holy Roman Emperor in 1433. On paper, his influence stretched across much of Europe. In reality, his authority was paper-thin, often challenged, often mocked, and rarely enforced with any lasting effect. Sigismund's early reign in Hungary was marred by conflict. After marrying Queen Mary of Hungary, he inherited not just a throne, but a nest of internal dissent and foreign enemies. The Hungarian nobility resisted his authority, viewing him as a foreigner. Civil unrest simmered. Intrigues brewed. More than once, he faced outright rebellion from his supposed allies. He was captured in 1397 by rebellious barons, imprisoned, and only released through a complex web of negotiations and shifting alliances. Yet even after regaining power, Sigismund showed little appetite for reform or decisive rule. His court was riddled with favoritism, and his grasp on Hungary remained tenuous. But it was in the broader stage of Christendom where Sigismund's failures became truly consequential. As the Ottoman Turks began to expand into the Balkans, the Christian kingdoms of Europe looked to Hungary as the bulwark, the frontier fortress that would resist the Islamic advance. Sigismund, to his credit, recognized the threat. He called for a crusade. Knights from across the continent, French, German, Burgundian, Polish, gathered beneath the cross. It was a moment ripe with hope. In 1396, this mighty host marched southward, banners fluttering, blades gleaming. Their target, the fortress city of Nicopolis, held by the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid Thans. But pride poisoned the campaign. The European knights, overconfident and dismissive of local tactics, ignored advice and charged recklessly into battle. The result was a disaster. The Ottomans crushed the Crusader army. Thousands were slain. Many nobles, including French princes and German lords, were captured. The survivors fled. Sigismund himself escaped only by fleeing down the Danube by boat, reportedly muttering, "We lost the day by the pride of the French." The defeat at Nicopolis marked a turning point. It shattered the illusion that Christendom could unite against the Turks. It exposed Sigismund's inability to lead a coalition, and it set the stage for the gradual Ottoman advance into southeastern Europe, a threat that would haunt Hungary for centuries to come. After the crusade, Sigismund retreated from martial heroism and turned his attention to diplomacy and court politics. He presided over the Council of Constance, 1414-1418, where he sought to end the papal schism, a time when multiple men claimed to be pope. The council succeeded in deposing rival claimants and electing Pope Martin V. It was Sigismund's most significant achievement, yet even this triumph was stained with cruelty. At the same council, the Czech reformer Jan Hus was summoned under a promise of safe conduct. Hus, a theologian critical of church corruption, arrived believing he could debate in good faith. Instead, he was arrested, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in 1415. Sigismund protested that he had guaranteed Hus's safety, but claimed his promise did not extend to matters of heresy. His name became synonymous with betrayal among the Czechs. His brother Wenceslaus had failed them through inaction. Sigismund failed them through broken word. Later, as King of Bohemia, he would face open revolt. The Hussite wars would rage across the region, a fire born from Hus's ashes. Sigismund, now Holy Roman Emperor, waged a series of campaigns to crush the Hussites. But again and again, he failed. The peasants and radicals, fighting with fierce conviction, humbled imperial armies. His reign became one of exhaustion, of repeated setbacks, of opportunities lost. Even in his final years, as emperor, Sigismund never wielded the authority that title once commanded. The Holy Roman Empire had become a shell of competing princes and squabbling electors. Sigismund, more often a mediator than a ruler, presided over the decline without reversing it. He died in 1437, leaving behind no strong heir and little affection from his people. His name does not inspire hatred, as Timur or Ivan might, but it rests quietly among those remembered for what they allowed to slip through their fingers. And so, Sigismund's reign was terrible not in fury, but in frailty. He watched as the defences of Europe cracked, as church unity was strained, and as trust in imperial leadership dissolved. He had moments of clarity, yes, flashes of nobility, of insight, but he lacked the strength to follow through. His story is a quiet reminder that not all dangers come from violence. Some come from delay, from hesitation, from promises broken and crusades poorly led. As we step away from the drifting banners of Nicopolis and the ash-strewn halls of Constance, we next turn to England once more, to a king whose charm, extravagance, and sudden cruelty would tear his realm apart from within. We return now to the damp green hills of England, where mists cling to moss-covered stone, and the echoes of ancient fealty still drift through the vaulted halls of old castles. Here, in the late 14th century, we meet a king whose life began in innocence and pageantry, but who would, through pride and misjudgment, become a symbol of royal failure. His name was Richard II, and though he wore the crown from boyhood, he would be remembered not for his youth or charm, but for the painful unravelling of his reign. Born in 1367, Richard was the son of Edward, the Black Prince, England's celebrated warrior. His grandfather was the mighty King Edward III. With such a lineage, greatness seemed his inheritance. But fate is fickle. Richard's father died before he could inherit the throne, and when Edward III passed away in 1377, the 10-year-old Richard became king. He ascended the throne with a golden coronet and wide, solemn eyes. The court rejoiced, the nobles pledged loyalty, and the people hoped for stability. But beneath the fanfare, the realm was trembling. England was weary, worn by war with France, bruised by famine, and strained by rising taxation. The child king inherited not a kingdom of ease, but a powder keg. The first great test came in 1381, the Peasants' Revolt. Anger had been brewing for years among the common folk, farmers and artisans burdened by taxes to fund endless wars. When a new poll tax was imposed, the countryside erupted in fury. Thousands marched on London under the leadership of Wat Tyler, demanding reforms, justice, and an end to serfdom. At just 14, Richard did the unthinkable. He rode out to meet the rebels at Mile End. He promised to listen, to consider their grievances. Some of the rebels dispersed, but others, emboldened, stormed the city. When their leader, Tyler, was killed during a tense parley, the situation teetered on chaos. Then, in a moment of striking bravery, young Richard addressed the rebels directly. "I am your captain now." He promised them peace, and they, awed by his courage, disbanded. The revolt ended, though most of the promised reforms were quietly revoked. This moment earned Richard early admiration, but it also planted seeds of pride, of the belief that his authority alone could sway crowds and bend reality. As he grew into manhood, Richard surrounded himself with favourites, men who flattered rather than advised. He developed a taste for luxury and ceremony. His court became a place of lavish spending, artistic patronage, and rigid hierarchy. Richard believed in the divine right of kings, not as a doctrine of responsibility, but as justification for absolute rule. This increasingly autocratic attitude clashed with the powerful nobles of the realm, particularly his uncle, John of Gaunt, and the baronial group known as the Lords Appellant. They accused the king's favourites of corruption and misrule, forcing their execution and imposing their own control over royal decisions. Richard simmered. He bided his time. And when he regained full control in the 1390s, he sought revenge. One by one, his political enemies were exiled, imprisoned, or executed. Parliament was purged of dissenters. He ruled without consultation, bypassing laws to enforce his will. Though England was at peace externally, the kingdom grew tense, cautious, fearful of the king's unpredictable wrath. Yet Richard could be charming, elegant in speech, a patron of literature, and deeply invested in the arts. He commissioned the famous Wilton diptych and encouraged poets like Geoffrey Chaucer. His reign gave England moments of cultural refinement, but no amount of culture could mend the fractures beneath the crown. In 1399, everything unravelled. Richard's cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, had been exiled after falling out of favour. When Gaunt died, Richard confiscated his lands, an act viewed widely as unjust and illegal. Henry returned from exile not as a rebel, but as a noble claiming what was his. The people, weary of Richard's high-handedness, welcomed Henry. The nobles rallied to him. Richard, away in Ireland at the time, returned to find his kingdom slipping. Through his fingers, he was captured without a battle and brought before Parliament. Under pressure, he abdicated, handing the crown to Henry, who became Henry IV. Richard was imprisoned, then quietly murdered in 1400. Some say he starved, others whisper of a dagger. His body was put on display to quash rumours of his survival. Thus ended the life of Richard II, a king who began with promise, who showed flashes of brilliance, but who allowed pride and vengeance to cloud his judgment. He was not evil. He was not mad. But he was deeply isolated, more concerned with symbolism than substance. He saw kingship as a divine play, where the monarch stood above the realm, not within it. In doing so, he lost the trust of his people and the loyalty of his lords. His fall marked the beginning of the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic conflict that would plague England for generations. Richard's tale is one of fragility, of a golden crown placed on a child's brow, and the slow, sorrowful descent into tyranny, not by bloodlust, but by disconnection. And as we leave the shadowed towers of the Tower of London behind, our path next leads us to the Balkan Hills, to a prince-turned-despot whose cruelty would rival that of any king. We travel now to a land of misty forests and steep mountain passes, where wolves howl beneath a moonlit sky and ancient fortresses cling to the cliffs like sentinels from forgotten ages. This is Wallachia, a principality nestled in the Balkans, harsh, proud, and perpetually caught between empires. And here, in the 15th century, ruled a prince whose name would echo far beyond his lifetime, a name that would become legend, myth, and dread. Vlad III, Dracula, known also as Vlad the Impaler. To many in the West, his story is shrouded in horror, distorted by Gothic fiction and the dark romance of vampire tales. But before he was the inspiration for Bram Stoker's immortal villain, Vlad was a real man, born of noble blood, shaped by cruelty, and remembered for a reign so terrifying that his own people could scarcely speak of it without a shudder. He was born in 1431 in Transylvania, the second son of Vlad II Dracul, a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order sworn to defend Christendom against the Ottoman Turks. From that title, Dracul, meaning the dragon, his son derived the name Dracula, the son of the dragon. But young Vlad's life was anything but noble serenity. At the age of 11, he and his brother Radu were taken hostage by the Ottoman court, a common diplomatic practice to ensure loyalty. There, in the glittering yet dangerous palace of Sultan Murads II, Vlad learned the art of statecraft and of cruelty. He observed punishments, executions, betrayals. He was treated well enough, but he never forgot that he was a prisoner. His brother Radu, more adaptable, even converted to Islam. But Vlad nurtured a deeper resentment, a wound that never healed. Released years later, Vlad returned to Wallachia to claim his father's throne. But the principality was no tranquil kingdom. It was a land of feuding boyars, powerful noble families who sought to control the throne for their own gain. Kings and princes came and went like seasons, many murdered, some vanished. Vlad's first reign was brief, barely lasting. A few months, he was deposed and exiled. But he returned again, and this time he stayed, and he ruled with terror. To secure his power, Vlad launched a brutal campaign against the boyars. He invited hundreds of nobles to a feast, then had them arrested. Some were impaled on stakes. Others were forced into labor to rebuild his fortress at Pinari, a steep citadel perched high in the mountains. Few survived. This act set the tone for his reign, uncompromising, ferocious, and utterly merciless. But it was his favored method of execution that earned him his chilling epithet, Tsepesh, the Impaler. Vlad believed impalement to be a just punishment for traitors, thieves, liars, and invaders. The condemned were hoisted upon sharpened stakes, often through the abdomen or chest, and left to die slowly, sometimes over days. Forests of the impaled lined the roads to his capital. Travelers spoke of hills covered in swaying bodies, of birds circling above the dead, of an eerie silence broken only by the groans of the dying. And yet, his land was safe. Crime plummeted. Merchants travelled freely. Justice, though draconian, was swift. One legend tells of a golden cup left on a fountain in Targoviste, untouched, unguarded, and never stolen. Such was the fear of Vlad's retribution. His most legendary act of horror came in 1462, during a renewed conflict with the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, marched into Wallachia with a vast army. Vlad retreated, using scorched earth tactics. When the Sultan reached Targoviste, he found a grisly sight. Over 20,000 impaled corpses arranged in geometric rows outside the city. The Sultan, though hardened by war, was shaken. He turned back. But Vlad's reign was not without resistance. His enemies, both domestic and foreign, plotted against him. His brother Radu, now aligned with the Ottomans, waged a campaign to install himself on the throne. Eventually, Vlad was captured and imprisoned by the Hungarians. He spent over a decade in captivity. Yet even there, his presence was unsettling. His captors reportedly kept him confined not for safety, but because they feared what he might do if left unchecked. He was released in 1475 and briefly regained his throne. But in 1476, during a skirmish with Ottoman forces, Vlad was killed. His head was taken to Constantinople, preserved in honey, and displayed on a pike to prove his death. And so passed Vlad III Dracula, not a vampire, not a myth, but a man. A ruler forged by violence, who met violence with a fury unmatched in the chronicles of his age. Was he evil? Some say so. His methods were gruesome, his punishments brutal, but others saw him as a necessary defender of a vulnerable land, a man who used terror not for its own sake, but as a weapon of survival. In Wallachia, even today, the memory of Vlad is conflicted. He is both villain and hero, a monster in Western tales, a protector in Eastern ones. His legacy is one of fear, but also of strength, of unwavering defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. And as we step away from the wind-blown peaks of Transylvania and the blood-stained roads of Targoviste, our next path leads us to France, where a boy king ascended amidst civil war, and whose rule collapsed into helplessness as his crown became a burden too heavy for his tender years. From the mountain passes of Wallachia, where the ghosts of the impaled still linger, we travel westward into the soft rolling vineyards and forested hills of late medieval France. Here, beneath the ancient oaks and within the fortified stone, keeps another kind of fear took root, not born of bloodied spears or cruel public spectacles, but of quiet whispers, locked doors, and veiled threats. This was the France of Louis XVIII, the king whom history would name the Spider, not for his brute force, but for his cunning, his careful manipulations, and the intricate web of control he spun across his realm. Born in 1423, Louis was the son of Charles VII, the king who reclaimed France from the ashes of the 100 Years' War. Louis was raised in a court healing from conflict, where the crown had been humbled and the nobles emboldened. As Dauphin, he grew up wary and watchful. He learned early that open power could provoke deadly resistance, better perhaps to work in shadows. He quarrelled often with his father, testing the limits of royal patience. At one point, their estrangement grew so deep that Charles banished his own son from court. Louis sought refuge in Burgundy, at the court of Duke Philip the Good, his future rival, though for a time his host. There, he studied the art of ducal politics, of balancing flattery with ambition. In 1461, Louis ascended the throne. The crown was his, but peace would not follow. France, though technically whole, remained a patchwork of powerful fiefs. Dukes and counts ruled like sovereigns. The king's writ barely reached the frontiers. And Louis, unlike his father, did not trust in the slow charm of reconciliation. He believed in strategy, in plots, in quiet conquest. He dressed plainly, often in drab clothes, more like a merchant than a monarch. He avoided grand ceremonies, preferring private audiences. He surrounded himself not with nobles, but with common-born advisors, men loyal to him, not their lineage. This alone infuriated the old aristocracy. His most notorious conflict was with Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, a prince as flamboyant and proud as Louis was secretive and calculating. Burgundy was rich, armed, and ambitious. Charles dreamed of creating a middle kingdom, a revived Lotharingia, stretching from the North Sea to the Alps. For Louis, this was intolerable. Their rivalry defined his reign. Louis used diplomacy where he could, treachery where he must. He sowed dissent within Burgundy's court, bribed Charles's enemies, and made treaties with the Swiss and the English to isolate him. At one point, when Charles grew too threatening, Louis offered to meet him in person to discuss peace. But Charles, sensing an opportunity, detained the king. For months, Louis was a prisoner in Burgundy. Though treated well, he was under heavy guard. He signed concessions, swore false oaths, and smiled through gritted teeth. When he was finally released, he tore up the treaties and set about undoing every promise he'd made. This was Louis XV's genius, not in armies or speeches, but in endurance, in patience, in the understanding that power could be wielded like silk thread, tightened slowly, without ever snapping. He built a vast network of spies and informants. He used messengers, bribery, and blackmail with equal deftness. Town criers and noble guests alike might unknowingly serve as his ears. His control extended into the heart of his nobles' own households. It was said you never knew who might be watching. Even the great dukes began to look over their shoulders. But Louis's methods were not bloodless. He kept a private prison, a fortified tower known as the Filette, or Little Girl, in Loches. There, political prisoners were kept in iron cages, suspended from walls, cages so small that one could neither lie down nor stand upright. His enemies vanished quietly. Sometimes they returned months or years later, broken and silent. More often, they did not return at all. He also employed public humiliation. Some rebellious nobles were paraded in shackles, their titles stripped, their lands confiscated. Others were forced to write public confessions, read aloud in churches, admitting treason. To cross Louis was to gamble with not only your life, but your legacy. And yet, under his rule, France grew stronger. He reformed the economy, standardized taxation, and encouraged commerce. He expanded royal lands, absorbed key territories, and outmaneuvered foreign threats. His central government grew more efficient, more loyal. The monarchy, once precarious, became a permanent fixture. Louis reasserted royal authority more effectively than any king since Philip IV. His methods were feared, his reforms often effective. But at what cost? He trusted few, loved fewer. His court was a place of tension, of glances exchanged, of letters intercepted. Even his own son, the future Charles VIII, was kept at arm's length. In his final years, suffering from illness and paranoia, Louis withdrew into the Château de Plessis-les-Tours, surrounded by guards, astrologers, and informers. There he died in 1483, racked by disease and fear, unable to trust, even in death, that the world he had so carefully bound would not unravel. He was buried quietly, without grand procession. The nobles he had outwitted sighed in relief. The people, weary but more secure, moved on. And so we remember Louis XV not as a monster of brutality, but as a master of fear, a king who understood that control did not always require a sword, only a whisper, a letter, a well-timed silence. In his reign, we see the power of subtle tyranny, the tyranny of webs, of quiet threats, of watching eyes in the dark. He showed the world that a king need not raise his voice to dominate. That fear, carefully spun, could bind a kingdom as tightly as chains. As we leave the winding corridors of Plessis and the ink-stained desks of spies, our next tale takes us to the Holy Roman Empire once more, where a king's obsession with grandeur would mask his failures, and where ideals would rot beneath the gold leaf of a hollow reign. We drift now into the twilight of the Renaissance, into a Europe trembling at the edge of modernity and mysticism, of science and superstition. And within this curious twilight stands a monarch unlike any we have met thus far, a man not driven by cruelty or conquest, but by wonder, isolation, and obsession. He ruled an empire, but seemed more lost within his own mind than within any court. This was Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Hungary, Bohemia, and Croatia, a sovereign whose rule was as gilded as it was fractured. Born in 1552 into the powerful Habsburg dynasty, Rudolf was raised amidst grandeur, but far from stability. He spent much of his youth at the Spanish court of Philip II, where the heavy solemnity of Catholicism and courtly ceremony left its mark. He returned to the Austrian lands reserved and peculiar, speaking little, observing much, and already showing signs of the deep introspection that would define his reign. Crowned emperor in 1576, Rudolf inherited not just vast lands, from Bohemia to Hungary, from Austria to parts of Italy, but also the impossible task of holding together a Holy Roman Empire divided by faith, politics, and rising tides of change. Yet Rudolf was not a ruler in the traditional sense. He loathed public appearances. He avoided meetings. His ministers often waited days, sometimes weeks, for decisions. He ruled from the great castle of Prague, which he transformed into a surreal court of philosophers, alchemists, artists, and eccentrics. There, amid vaulted ceilings and whispered secrets, Rudolf built his golden cage, a court so strange and brilliant that it shimmered more like a dream than a government. He surrounded himself with thinkers and creators, the astronomer Tycho Brahe, the mathematician Johannes Kepler, and countless occultists who promised to unlock the mysteries of the universe. His libraries overflowed with grimoires and treatises, his cabinets with rare stones, bones, mechanical oddities, and ancient scrolls. He collected automata and curiosities from every corner of Europe and beyond. But while Prague became a beacon of esoteric knowledge, the empire frayed. Rudolf's mind, so curious, so brilliant, grew increasingly unstable. He suffered from deep melancholia, what we would now call depression, marked by long periods of silence, paranoia, and isolation. He withdrew from public life, neglected statecraft, and allowed crucial decisions to languish. Religious tensions tore at the empire. The Protestant Reformation had not healed. In Bohemia, Protestant nobles pushed for rights and recognition. In Austria, Catholic zeal burned hot. In Hungary, the threat of the Ottomans loomed. Yet Rudolf, rather than confront these divisions, buried himself in astrology and visions of a universal truth that might never be found. His court became a place of suspicion. Servants walked softly. Ministers dared not press. Messages were ignored. Nobles traveled to Prague and left disheartened. Foreign ambassadors waited months for audience. Governance passed not through policy, but through inaction. And where power weakens, others rise. Rudolf's own family began to lose faith in his rule. His younger brother Matthias seized the reins. First Hungary, then Austria, and finally Bohemia declared for Matthias. In 1608, Rudolf was forced to sign away nearly all of his authority. He retained the title of emperor, but little else. The man who once ruled a glittering empire now held court in a shrinking circle of candles and dreams. He wandered his halls alone. He talked to shadows. He signed meaningless edicts while the fate of nations passed him by. And yet, Rudolf remains a figure of fascination. He was not a tyrant, not cruel. His flaws were not born of malice, but of distance from the world, from duty, and perhaps from himself. He loved beauty, mystery, and the promise of hidden knowledge more than he ever loved governance. His obsession with alchemy and immortality may seem mad to us now, but it came from a desire to understand, to control the chaos of a world slipping from comprehension. In this, he was no different from many in his age. He simply drifted further. When Rudolf died in 1612, his empire was already cracking. Within a decade, Europe would plunge into the 30 Years' War, a conflict that would devastate the Holy Roman Empire and redraw the continent. His failure to unify his realms or resolve the religious crisis contributed to the war's outbreak, a legacy of inaction that bore consequences far beyond his quiet halls. And so we remember Rudolf II as a tragic sovereign. Not a monster, but a man lost in the stars. His life is a cautionary tale of detachment, of dreams pursued at the cost of reality. He reminds us that a ruler may possess knowledge, vision, and passion, and yet fail utterly if they do not also hold resolve. His Prague was a palace of marvels, his court a living museum of wonder. But the empire needed more than marvels. It needed a hand to guide, a heart to decide. As we step quietly out of Rudolf's candlelit corridors, past shelves of forgotten books and dusty machines that never moved, our journey leads us next to the sunburnt plains of Naples, where a monarch inherited a kingdom and through foolishness and fury tore it to shreds. We now descend into the sunlit south of Italy, where lemon groves scent the breeze and the sea rolls gently against ancient shores. This is Naples, a city of gold and ash, crowned by hills and shadowed by the quiet menace of Mount Vesuvius. In the 15th century, it was a kingdom of immense wealth and political complexity, caught between competing dynasties and foreign ambition. And into this realm came a king whose reign would be remembered for cunning, cruelty, and the quiet fear he inspired in all who came near. This was Ferdinand I of Naples, called by some Ferrante, and known by others as the Wolf King. He was not born to rule. The illegitimate son of Alfonso V of Aragon, Ferdinand came into power not through royal blood alone, but by the will of a father who saw in him both loyalty and ruthlessness. When Alfonso conquered Naples in 1442, he named Ferdinand his heir, bypassing more legitimate claimants and setting the stage for decades of bloodshed. Ferdinand was crowned King of Naples in 1458. From the very beginning, his reign was precarious. The noble families of Naples resented him, seeing him as a foreign usurper with no true right to the throne. Rebellion was constant. Plots simmered behind every banquet, and alliances shifted like the winds along the coast. Yet Ferdinand was not easily unseated. He was intelligent, disciplined, and coldly calculating. He spoke several languages, kept extensive personal notes on political enemies, and employed a secret police long before such a term existed. His spies moved through every level of society, reporting whispers, tracking loyalties, and eliminating threats with quiet efficiency. His court glittered with Renaissance elegance. Poets, scholars, and artists found patronage under his rule. But beneath the polish lay iron. Ferdinand's justice was swift and merciless. Trials were rare. Accusations were often enough. The most infamous episode of his reign came after the Barons' Conspiracy of 1485, a noble-led rebellion that sought to replace him with a French-backed claimant. The revolt failed, and Ferdinand responded with methodical vengeance. He invited the leading conspirators to a reconciliation feast, welcomed them with warm smiles, rich wines, and soft music. Then he had them arrested. Some were executed immediately. Others were imprisoned in the deep cells of Castelnuovo. But Ferdinand's cruelty was not always visible. It was often psychological. He kept some rebels alive for years, showing them mercy, then executing them suddenly without warning. One noble was shown the bodies of his friends each day before being led back to his cell. Ferdinand believed in control through fear, not chaos, not slaughter, but the slow, precise erosion of resistance. It was said that his dungeons beneath Naples were unlike any other, filled not with filth and rats, but polished stone cells, designed to silence rather than to rot. The condemned were not tortured into madness, but into despair. And yet, despite this ruthless streak, Ferdinand was respected by foreign powers. He balanced diplomacy with France, the Papal States, and the Aragonese crown. He strengthened the Neapolitan navy and expanded trade. He invested in agriculture and infrastructure, turning Naples into a glittering jewel of southern Europe. But love from his subjects eluded him. The common people feared his punishments. The nobles despised his origins. Even within his family, loyalty was brittle. His son Alfonso would inherit not only the crown, but also the many vendettas left unfinished by his father. Ferdinand ruled for nearly 4 decades. His grip never loosened. He died in 1494, not in disgrace or exile, but in his palace, surrounded by the wealth and silence he had so carefully cultivated. His death marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, one filled with invasions, betrayals, and the ruin of all he had built. Just months after his passing, Charles VIII of France launched his campaign into Italy, invading Naples and scattering Ferdinand's legacy to the winds. His carefully crafted kingdom collapsed like a chessboard overturned. So what are we to make of Ferdinand the Foreign of Naples? He was not beloved, nor widely mourned. His monuments were overshadowed by his successors' failures, yet his rule was undeniably effective. He brought order to chaos. He held a kingdom together by force of will. But in doing so, he sacrificed trust, joy, and perhaps even his soul. He was the wolf in a king's robe, patient, cunning, always watching. A man who ruled not with grandeur, but with teeth just beneath the surface. And so we leave the palaces of Naples behind, their sun-drenched facades hiding centuries of fear and silence. We pass through the great bronze gates of Castelnuovo into the cool darkness of memory and move onward. Our next chapter takes us to the rain-slick streets of medieval Poland, where a monarch's thirst for power drove him to betrayal, and whose final days were spent in a cell, his crown lost to his own ambition. Now we step into the colder mists of Eastern Europe, to the heart of Poland in the 15th century, a land of broad rivers, dark forests, and rising ambition. Here, where the Vistula flowed steady beneath castle bridges and wooden villages clung to wind-swept fields, a young king would take the throne with hope and courage, but end his reign in ruin, lost beneath the waves of history. This was Władysław III, a boy king of 2 crowns, Poland and Hungary, who dreamed of greatness, but whose story became one of miscalculation, youthful pride, and tragic sacrifice. A king who sought to forge a legacy through war, but instead drowned in a sea of ambition. Władysław was born in 1424, son of Władysław II Jagiełło, the great Lithuanian-Polish monarch, who had defeated the Teutonic Knights at Grunwald and carved out a powerful dual kingdom. Upon his father's death in 1434, the 10-year-old Władysław inherited the Polish crown. As with so many child kings before him, he ruled at first only in name, with a council of nobles and regents managing the affairs of the realm. Yet from the start, Władysław showed signs of independence. He was bold, headstrong, and deeply devout. Poland, then, was not merely a kingdom. It was a bulwark of Christendom, a frontier realm pressed between Catholic Europe and the Muslim Ottoman Empire. and Władysław believed it was his destiny to defend that frontier with the sword. In 1440, he was offered a second crown, Hungary. That kingdom, weary from internal division and threatened by the expansion of the Ottomans, sought a strong king to unify and defend them. At only 16, Władysław accepted, now ruling two great realms, straddling east and west. But the union of these crowns brought not unity, but confusion. Hungary was already tangled in civil strife. Another claimant to the throne, the infant Ladislaus the Posthumous, had his own supporters, backed by powerful Austrian and Bohemian interests. Władysław found himself at the center of competing loyalties. The Polish magnates worried about losing influence. The Hungarian nobility feared Polish dominance, and Władysław himself was torn between idealism and pragmatism. Into this unrest stepped the Pope. Eugene IV, desperate to stem the Ottoman tide, urged Władysław to lead a crusade, a holy war to reclaim the Balkans and push back Sultan Murad II. Fired by youthful fervor and the glory of the cross, Władysław agreed. He formed an alliance with John Hunyadi, the famed Hungarian general, and gathered an army of Poles, Hungarians, Wallachians, and Crusaders from across Europe. The Sicily plan was ambitious. In 1443, Władysław launched his first campaign into the Balkans. The winter march was harsh, but successful. Ottoman forces were pushed back. Morale soared. The young king, just 19, seemed destined for sainthood and song. Then came the fatal year, 1444. The Pope negotiated a truce with the Ottomans. Murad II, weary of war, agreed to peace. But in a fateful decision, Władysław, encouraged by his generals and perhaps by his own burning pride, broke the treaty. He believed the Sultan was weak, that one more blow would destroy the Ottoman hold in Europe. A final march was planned, swift and decisive. The army sailed from Hungary, crossing the Danube and advancing into Ottoman territory. But Murad, incensed by the betrayal, returned to command his army personally. The two forces met at Varna, a coastal city on the Black Sea, on November 10, 1444. The Battle of Varna was brutal. Władysław, though brave, was outmatched. His forces were surrounded. Yet the young king refused to retreat. He led a desperate cavalry charge toward the heart of the Ottoman lines, seeking to strike at Murad himself. Accounts differ. Some say his horse was slain, others that he was pulled from the saddle. But all agree on one point. He was beheaded in the melee, his head mounted on a pike. He was just 20 years old. His body was never recovered. His army collapsed. The crusade ended in disaster. Poland mourned, Hungary wept, and Christendom fell into shock. The Ottomans would not be driven back for another century. Władysław's death marked not only the failure of a campaign, but the death of hope for a unified front against the empire of the Crescent Moon. In the decades that followed, his memory lingered like a ghost. Some believed he survived, wandering as a penitent knight in exile. Others said he fled east and lived in secret. Songs were sung of the young king who would return in the realm's hour of need, but he never did. So what legacy did Władysław III leave? He was not a tyrant nor cruel. He did not oppress his people or squander his wealth, but he was reckless, consumed by the dream of crusading glory in an age when such dreams had become dangerously out of step with reality. His failure was one of vision and pride. He underestimated his enemies, overestimated his allies, and allowed religious zeal to blind his judgment, and in doing so, he doomed not only himself, but thousands of men who followed him into the sea-swept graveyard of Varna. He reminds us that even noble dreams can lead to ruin, if not tempered with wisdom. As we leave behind the battlefield, now, long silent beneath the waves, our journey next takes us north again, to the brooding forests and lakes of Scandinavia, where a king's violent rages and ungovernable heart would lead to one of the darkest reigns in Nordic history. The road winds now through deep pine forests and across silent, glacial lakes, northward into the realm of the midnight sun, Sweden, a land of ancient kings and stark, windswept beauty. In the 16th century, Sweden stood at the threshold of greatness, emerging from civil war and poised to assert itself on the European stage. But that hope would tremble under the reign of a king whose brilliance was eclipsed by his paranoia, whose strength gave way to madness. This was Eric XIV of Sweden, son of Gustav Vasa, first of his line, and a man whose name would be forever, tied not to victory or wisdom, but to a crown unravelling under the weight of its wearer's mind. Born in 1533, Eric was the eldest son of Gustav Vasa, the founder of modern Sweden, who had liberated the country from Danish rule. Raised with high expectations, Eric was bright, well-educated, and deeply interested in the arts and sciences. He spoke multiple languages, read widely, and seemed at first glance to embody the Renaissance ideal of the philosopher king. But beneath the polished surface of intellect lay shadows. Even in youth, Eric displayed fits of melancholy, erratic moods, and an intense sensitivity to insult. These traits would deepen with time, shaping a reign marked by brilliance undone by instability. Eric ascended the throne in 1560, at the age of 27. The realm he inherited was ambitious but fragile. His father had centralized power, reduced the nobility's influence, and laid the foundation for Swedish independence. Eric was expected to expand upon this, to lead Sweden into an age of strength. At first, he seemed equal to the task. He continued administrative reforms, supported trade, and championed Swedish art and literature. He envisioned a northern empire seeking to marry into European royalty and make Sweden a true power among nations. He also founded Uppsala University, strengthening the intellectual fabric of the kingdom. But even as his achievements grew, so, too, did the tremors of his mind. He became obsessed with legitimacy and betrayal. His half-brothers John and Charles, sons of Gustav Vasa by a second wife, were close rivals. Eric feared their ambitions. His court became a place of suspicion. Spies whispered in corridors. Letters were opened. Conversations twisted into accusations. In 1563, Eric's paranoia ignited the Northern 7 Years' War. Against Denmark and Lubeck, Sweden fought bitterly. The war drained resources and cost thousands of lives. Eric's erratic decisions, firing commanders, punishing allies, undermined Sweden's position. But it was not just on the battlefield that his mind faltered. In 1567, the paranoia reached its peak. Eric became convinced that the noble Sture family was plotting against him. He summoned Niels Sture, a respected courtier, and had him imprisoned and tortured. Then, in a fit of rage at Uppsala Castle, Eric personally murdered Niels with a dagger. Not long after, he ordered the execution of 5 more nobles, without trial. These killings became known as the Sture murders, and they sent shockwaves through Sweden. The nobility recoiled in horror. Even Eric's own allies began to question his sanity. Reports from the time speak of a king wandering the halls in remorse, weeping uncontrollably, then erupting into violent fits. His servants feared to approach him. His moods shifted by the hour, and yet, even amidst this unravelling, Eric made gestures of normalcy. He married Karin Månsdotter, a commoner, in a controversial but sincere act of love. He sought redemption through art and poetry, writing verses filled with longing and regret. He tried to balance the monarch he wished to be with the torment that consumed him, but it was too late. In 1568, his half-brother John, imprisoned earlier for plotting against him, escaped and led a rebellion. Supported by the nobility and key military commanders, John marched on Stockholm. Eric was deposed, his wife and children imprisoned. His crown passed to John, who became John III. Eric was moved from fortress to fortress for the next decade. His captors feared his lingering influence. Though no longer king, many still viewed him as the rightful monarch. He wrote letters, pleaded for release, and composed melancholy poems about his lost reign. He was allowed occasional visits with his family, but watched closely, always under guard. His final years were lonely and shrouded in sorrow. In 1577, at the age of 44, he died in Urbihus Castle. Most historians agree he was poisoned, ordered by his brother's court, who feared what he might yet become, and so passed Erik XIV, the Mad King of Sweden. His reign remains one of the most tragic in Nordic history, for Erik was no fool, no tyrant in the traditional sense. He dreamed of glory, of a learned and powerful kingdom. He sought to elevate Sweden through intellect and ambition, but his mind betrayed him. His fear became a mirror that reflected only treachery. His story is not merely one of madness, but of fragility, of a brilliant man undone not by enemies, but by his own storm-tossed soul. He reminds us that the crown, though golden, can press heavily upon a fragile brow, that no amount of learning or vision can defend against the shadows that grow from within. As we step away from the icy walls of Urbihus, our final chapters await us. We shall next visit the alpine strongholds of Savoy, where a duke turned king would rise with fire in his eyes and leave behind a realm trembling under the weight of his wrath. The mountains of Savoy rise like stone prayers, their jagged edges kissed by clouds, their valleys winding through centuries of quiet power. Nestled between France and Italy, this alpine duchy held a strategic key to Europe, always perched on the cusp of greatness, yet always in the shadow of stronger kingdoms. And from this cold cradle of ambition came a man who clawed his way to kingship with cunning, force, and an unyielding sense of purpose. His name was Victor Amadeus II, Duke of Savoy, later King of Sardinia, a ruler whose life unfolded like a tightly coiled spring, stretched between brilliance and tyranny. A man whose final act would not be to conquer or to triumph, but to lock himself behind stone walls of his own choosing. Victor Amadeus was born in 1666 into the House of Savoy, a dynasty with dreams far greater than its borders. His father died when he was young, and his mother, the formidable Marie-Jeanne of Savoy, ruled as regent. She governed with ambition, grooming her son to preserve their realm amidst the shifting alliances of Europe. But young Victor bristled under her control. The court of Turin became a battlefield not of armies, but of wills. At 15, he orchestrated a quiet coup, seizing control and sending his mother into retirement. From that day on, he ruled as his own man, cold, methodical, and ever watchful. He quickly proved a capable ruler. He reformed the army, improved tax systems, and centralized authority. Yet his court was austere, lacking the warmth and splendor of Versailles or Vienna. Victor was not a king of festivals. He was a king of strategy. During the War of the Spanish Succession, Victor played his hand with ruthless skill. Initially siding with France, he later switched allegiance to the Austrian Habsburgs. He withstood the siege of Turin in 1706, emerging not just as a survivor, but as a victor. In recognition, the Treaty of Utrecht granted him the crown of Sicily, and later, by negotiation, Sardinia, a title that made him a true king. From duke to king, his ascent was complete, but his rule, now heavier with responsibility, turned darker. He viewed his court with suspicion. Ministers came and went like pawns. He kept advisors isolated from one another, ensuring none could grow too powerful. He punished dissent, not with bloodshed, but with exile, silence, and disappearance. Victor governed his realm as a chessboard, each province a square, each noble a piece to be moved or removed. He believed in order, but not in mercy. Even his own family was not spared. His son, Charles Emmanuel, the heir, was treated with scorn. His education supervised like that of a prisoner rather than a prince. And yet, for all his coldness, Victor was respected. His reign brought modernization. Roads were built through mountain passes. Laws were streamlined. Trade expanded. Savoy, long a minor player, stood taller among the courts of Europe. But it was not love that bound his people to him. It was fear. Then, in 1730, something changed. After nearly 50 years of rule, Victor abdicated. He handed the throne to his son, retired to Chambéry, and withdrew from public life. At first, it seemed a peaceful transition, an old man yielding to time. But it was not peace that drove him. It was fatigue, paranoia, perhaps even guilt. Some say he feared assassination. Others say his health, mental or physical, had begun to falter. He took few visitors, lived modestly, and fell into long periods of silence. Then, 2 years later, he made a fatal decision. Victor sought to reclaim the throne. Whether driven by regret, by suspicion of his son's rule, or by an unshakable sense of destiny, he declared his abdication invalid. He attempted to rally support. He expected loyalty. He found little. Charles Emmanuel, the new king, acted swiftly. He had his father arrested, not publicly, not with violence, but with quiet firmness. Victor was confined to the castle of Rivoli, later moved to the castle of Moncalieri, kept under guard. His own son held the keys. There, in those cold stone chambers, Victor spent his last years, cared for, but alone. A king who had ruled without pity now tasted the slow bitterness of isolation. He died in 1732, behind palace walls, not as a monarch, but as a cautionary tale. His end was not bloody or heroic. It was strangely quiet, almost invisible, a whisper of what once was a roar, and yet his story lingers. Victor Amadeus II was not a monster. He was a reformer, a modernizer, a builder of kingdoms. But his rule was marked by control without compassion. He trusted no one, loved sparingly, and governed not as a father but as a watchman. His final act, retracting his abdication, was perhaps the truest glimpse into his heart. He could not bear to let go. He could not live without the crown. And, in reaching for it once more, he was caged not by others, but by his own need. So we remember him not as a tyrant of flame, but as a king of ice and iron, whose kingdom rose under his will, but whose humanity froze behind the walls he built. As we step from the alpine silence into the final bends of our path, only 2 chapters remain. We next descend into the Iberian, twilight once more, where a monarch's decadence and superstition would hasten the fall of an empire already crumbling under its own weight. We descend now into the twilight of empire, where the golden banners of Spain no longer fly with the wind of triumph, but hang heavy with sorrow. The vast dominion of Charles V and Philip II, the empire where the sun never set, had begun to crumble. Its grandeur, once forged in conquest and faith, now sagged beneath the weight of debt, decay, and dynastic exhaustion. And at the center of this fading world sat a king more pitied than feared, more whispered about than obeyed, a monarch whose very body bore the marks of a faltering empire. His name was Charles II of Spain, the last of the Habsburg kings of Spain, and the final frail link in a chain too long stretched. Born in 1661 to King Philip IV and his niece Mariana of Austria, Charles was the product of generations of Habsburg intermarriage. The family, obsessed with maintaining bloodline purity, had ignored the dangers of such unions. Charles paid the price. He was born disfigured and weak. His jaw was so deformed that he could barely chew. His tongue was oversized, his gait unstable. He suffered seizures, chronic digestive issues, and numerous illnesses throughout his life. His intellect was delayed, and he spoke with difficulty. He did not learn to walk until he was 4, and some questioned whether he would survive infancy at all. And yet, he became king at the age of 4, when his father died in 1665. Spain was then a shadow of its former self. Its economy staggered under inflation and mismanagement. Its armies, once feared, were thin and unpaid. Its colonies groaned with neglect. Into this crumbling palace of ghosts walked a child barely strong enough to speak. For much of his early life, Charles was ruled by his mother and a circle of court favorites. His education was limited, his exposure to statecraft minimal. He was treated more as a relic than a ruler. an object of devotion, a symbol of continuity, even as the reality of governance slipped further from his grasp. As he grew older, he showed occasional sparks of curiosity, but his health and paranoia worsened. He became deeply religious, attending mass obsessively, surrounding himself with monks and confessors. He believed himself cursed. He feared witches, sorcery, and the devil. It is said that he once ordered the exhumation of royal ancestors, hoping to break a magical hex. He blamed his infertility and illness on dark forces, rather than the plain truth of his lineage. 2 marriages produced no children. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, died young, worn down by life at the Spanish court. His second, Maria Anna of Neuburg, arrived with promise, but soon realized the futility of producing an heir. Charles's condition worsened. His body wasted. His mind frayed. The Spanish court, meanwhile, became a viper's nest of intrigue. Foreign powers watched eagerly. France and Austria each hoped to place their candidate on the Spanish throne. Factions formed around these claimants. Diplomats whispered in corners. Nobles took sides. All waited for Charles to die. But Charles lived on, longer than many expected. Through sickness, seizures, and sorrow, he endured. He read religious texts, signed decrees he scarcely understood, and drifted through the halls of El Escorial like a ghost in a crown. His final years were marked by increasing isolation. He suffered blackouts, bouts of blindness, and long periods of incoherence. He became obsessed with his legacy, tortured by the knowledge that he would leave Spain without an heir, and that his death would spark a European war. Indeed, it did. In 1700, at the age of 38, Charles died. His body, when examined, was a wreck. One physician claimed his heart was the size of a peppercorn. He was buried in the royal crypt, the last Spanish Habsburg, an end not with a bang, but with a wheeze. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession as France and Austria vied for control. The war would rage for over a decade, drawing in nearly every major power in Europe. Villages burned, cities were razed, thousands died, all because of the power vacuum Charles left behind. So how are we to remember Charles II of Spain? He was not evil, he was not cruel, he did not issue edicts of tyranny or march armies into senseless war, but he was a terrible king, terrible in the truest sense, of a reign marked by absence, misfortune, and helplessness. He was the end of a line not just of blood, but of an era. His reign was the sigh of an empire collapsing under its own splendor, a man born into greatness, but denied even the strength to lift its weight. In his story, we find the tragic cost of dynastic obsession, the danger of prioritizing heritage over health, and the sorrow of a crown placed on shoulders too weak to bear it. As we close this penultimate chapter, only one tale remains, one more king, perhaps the most debated of all, a monarch of towering ambition and ruthless clarity. His name would shape the very idea of absolutism, and his shadow would stretch across centuries. The final steps of our long journey bring us to the grandest stage in all of early modern Europe, Versailles, a palace of mirrors and gardens, of gold leaf and whispered secrets. Here lived a king who did not merely reign, but embodied his kingdom. His every gesture became law, his court defined elegance, his wars redrew borders, his presence cast light and heat alike. This was Louis XIV of France, known across the world as Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King. And though many saw him as a symbol of glory and order, others saw only the shadows cast behind that blinding light. He was born in 1638, the long-awaited heir to King Louis XIII and Queen Anne of Austria. When his father died in 1643, Louis became king at the age of 4. The realm fell into the hands of his formidable mother and her minister, Cardinal Mazarin. These early years were marked by civil unrest, the Fronde, a series of revolts by nobles and city leaders who resented the crown's growing power. Louis never forgot the terror of those times. He would later say, "L'État, c'est moi." I am the state. When Mazarin died in 1661, Louis stunned his court by announcing he would govern without a chief minister. It was unheard of. Kings delegated. Louis would rule alone. And he did. For 72 years, the longest reign of any monarch in European history. He built Versailles, not just as a home, but as a statement. Everything about it declared his power. The symmetry, the scale, the constant presence of the monarch at its heart. Nobles were required to live there, to serve him, to dance attendance. Power was drawn into the orbit of the king like planets around a star. Louis reformed the military, the economy, the legal system. He promoted industry and patronized the arts. Molière, Lully, Racine. His court was a cradle of French culture. French became the language of diplomacy. France became the model of absolutism. All bowed to the will of the Sun King. And yet, beneath the gleam, something darker stirred. Louis's wars were vast and frequent. The War of Devolution, the Dutch War, the War of the League of Augsburg, and the War of the Spanish Succession. Each left France bleeding. Fields were razed. Fortresses bombarded. Men died by the tens of thousands. Taxes rose. The peasantry starved. His greatest folly may have been the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. That edict, passed by his grandfather, Henry IV, had granted religious tolerance to France's Protestants, the Huguenots, but Louis, seeing religious unity as a path to political unity, tore it down. Protestant churches were burned, schools closed, families fled. An estimated 200,000 Huguenots, many of them skilled artisans and merchants, left France for England, Prussia, the Netherlands, and beyond. In doing so, Louis not only inflicted misery on his own people, but weakened France's economy and strengthened his rivals. And in Versailles, the king grew ever more distant. His days were ritualized down to the minute. The lever, his morning rising, was a public performance. Nobles competed for the honor of handing him his slippers. His meals were observed. His movements were watched. He became not just king, but spectacle. And like the sun itself, too much exposure to his light could burn. Ministers fell from favor overnight. Courtiers were ruined for a word. Surveillance was constant. Letters were opened. Dissent was crushed. Even his own family was subject to his authority. His sons and grandsons married at his command, served in his wars, and often died before him. As he aged, Louis grew more austere. His longtime mistress, Madame de Montespan, fell from favor. He married Madame de Maintenon, a pious and strict woman who encouraged deeper religious devotion. His court, once lively, grew quiet and constrained. Yet, through all, he continued to rule. Even in his 80s, he read reports, signed documents, held audiences. His health faltered. He lost teeth, suffered gout, grew thin. But his grip never weakened. He outlived his son, his grandson, and even his great-grandson's mother. When he died in 1715, his 5-year-old great-grandson became Louis XV. Louis, fourth left behind a France both exalted and exhausted. His legacy is monumental. He defined absolutism. He reshaped European politics. His palace, his art, his wars, they became the gold standard, for better or worse. Kings across Europe copied his style. Empires rose in response to his ambition. But he also left a country, deep in debt, racked by famine, and burdened by a centralized state that could no longer adapt. He was a great king. But was he a good one? That question still haunts historians. Louis XIV shows us the double edge of majesty. He reminds us that brilliance can blind, that control can suffocate, and that even the sun sets. He ruled longer than any king on our list, but his reign, like the others, was marked by human frailty, by pride, by the aching cost of power. And now, dear listener, our journey comes to an end. We have walked the echoing halls of 22 monarchs, some cruel, some mad, some tragic. We have touched crowns and shackles. witnessed battles and betrayals, and stood in the long silence after each king's final breath. History does not forget its terrible kings, nor should we, for they remind us that power, untempered by wisdom or grace, does not elevate, it consumes, and that in every crown, however golden, there lies a weight only few can bear. Would you like the full compilation formatted into a single document or text file?